Hello, everybody, and welcome to Forever Sports. And very interesting story coming out in New Zealand Rugby, and that is Ardie Savea could potentially walk away from the All Blacks ahead of the 2027 Rugby World Cup, as he's apparently coming in a bit of a standoff with regards to the current coaches within the All Black setup, and a bit of a player revolt really potentially brewing under Scott Robertson and Scott Hansen, who are, not in a particularly good situation with regards to the All Blacks in terms of the environment. I think that's currently there. Now, this could have potentially huge ramifications because there is a potentially a player revolt, which we'll talk a little about with regards to the fact that Ardie Savea is exploring options like staying in Japan further than just this season, potentially making a move to Leinster, all of which could potentially see him take an early exit from his All Black contract and rule him out of the 2027 Rugby World Cup. That is, for example, if nothing happens within the coaching staff. However, if this kind of gets to a situation where all the best players refuse to kind of play and they have to make a big decision like sack the coaching staff, then all of a sudden, as Springbok fans, maybe we might need to worry because we might be seeing a situation where Jamie Joseph, for example, might be given the phone call. And he is someone who's always been very sort of open about the fact that he wants to bring in a Tony Brown rather into the coaching setup. So we then all of a sudden, as South Africans, might be a bit worried about what that kind of means for Tony Brown with regards to the World Cup and whether they might see him potentially make an early exit. So very, very interesting times in terms of the rugby world. But if you want to get to it, please do smash like on the video. Please do subscribe to the channel as well. So this is the story that came out today, saying that Ardie Savea is apparently, quote unquote, seriously unhappy with all the fingers being pointed to Scott Robertson. And apparently he's at the heart of the players, Scott Robertson rather, is in the heart of players discontent, but that there's quite a big player group, which includes Ardie Savea, who I think's probably got the most sway in that change room. Yes, a Scott Barrett is officially the captain, but we're talking about, a former World Player of the Year, one of the best players in the world, the best All Blacks player of the last 4 or 5 years, really, to be honest, and one of the massive, probably one of the biggest leaders in that change room. And New Zealand Herald last month reports the fact that there was a lot of frustration, a widespread internal frustration within the All Black setup. And that, lots of players weren't happy. However, now it's coming out that it is so bad that Ardie Savea is apparently looking at potentially staying at Kobe Steelers, which is where he's supposed to be doing a short-term 2026 campaign before going back into the New Zealand setup. Or even potentially making a move to Europe, with Leinster apparently being the destination. We've seen Jordie Barrett go there. We've seen Rieko Ioane go there. And, a move like that would move him out of the picture for the 2027 World Cup. Because as I said, at this stage, if you're not playing your rugby in New Zealand, you cannot represent the All Blacks. At the moment, it says it is understood that there are some disgruntled individuals within the setup. Robertson's job was not thought to be under threat, but the sheer scale of disfaction could force New Zealand Rugby to act. And this is the thing. If you, for example, start losing, I don't know, the Barretts, an Ardie Savea, a Cam Roigard, players like, Cody Taylor. If you start losing those kind of players, Will Jordan, for example, and they start getting together saying, we're not happy, we're not going to play for them, New Zealand Rugby will have to make a decision. They'll have to probably go and look at sacking Scott Robertson, making those changes, because you're not going to be competitive in the next World Cup unless you have those players. At the end of the day, you need the various Barretts, although I don't think they had their best year as a collective last year, but you need a Will Jordan, you need a Cody Taylor, you need an Ardie Savea. There's so many players, Cameron Wigott, there's so many players that are so important to that All Black side, which have maybe underperformed at certain at points, but are still world-class players. And if you don't have the backing of them, you're not going to succeed. I think that's the main thing. As soon as players lose faith in coaches, you're dead in the water. That is why Rassie Erasmus has won 2 World Cups in a row, and at this stage is a favourite to win a 3rd World Cup, because he's got players who will run through brick walls for him. Whereas I think Scott Robertson right now have got players who wouldn't go to the day and spar with him. They just don't want him around. And I think that as soon as you do kind of get into that situation as a governing body, you got to make the big call and look at making the change. And I mean, it would be a massive call. And this is what the article mentions, the fact that, making that change 2 years out of the World Cup would be a pretty big decision. Now, what maybe might be more likely is potentially a change within the assistant coach. And I think this is probably at the very bare minimum that New Zealand Rugby could potentially do. And that is look at changing the support staff, really, and saying, right, if Scott Hansen's an issue, for example, how do they replace him? How do they bring in other figures within the coaching staff to get the players aligned, to get them back on side, to get the All Blacks playing in the way they want to play, to get the performance levels to where they're at, so they can be competitive come the next World Cup. Because they're expected to compete. They're expected to be one of the favourites amongst South Africa, France, Ireland, potentially Australia. They can get their act together. England, obviously, really trending in the right direction to potentially be possibly one of the favourites for the World Cup. Now, from a South African perspective, we don't want to see a bad All Black side. We want to see a competitive All Black side. We've got the greatest rivalry tour this year. We want it to be a good tour. More than this, though, I worry about the fact that Tony Brown is someone who's obviously doing fantastic things with the Boks, and New Zealand Rugby aren't blind. They'll know that he's been a big part of this Bok turnaround. They'll know the IP he has within the sort of the Springboks setup, and I think that there's a huge target on his back to try and come and get him, to really bring him back to New Zealand. And I mean, obviously he's long term. We will lose him, I think, back to New Zealand Rugby. It just seems a matter of time, really. The question now is, can SA Rugby keep him until 2027? Can they ward off any interest? Can they keep New Zealand Rugby at bay? Have they locked him down with decent terms, even beyond 2027, and that they can enforce and make sure that we don't lose Tony and Brown going into the World Cup next year? Because it would be a massive loss to the Springboks. It would be a bit of a speed bump. And I think more importantly, he'd be obviously taking everything he knows about the Boks into that environment. So from a Bok point of view, seeing changes in the New Zealand Rugby coaching staff is worrying, because they're definitely going to try and look at a Tony Brown, and we can't afford to lose him, and we can't afford for him to be taking stuff back with him. I'm not saying that he would necessarily go in and say, right, this is exactly what's happened, but it's natural. As a coach, you're always going to try and provide insight as to where you are. And you can't sit there sign basically non-disclosure that you can't mention anything. So he'll have insight over there, and he'll understand what's worked and what's not worked, because you understand what they've analyzed when they've done things wrong and how to fix things. So it's slightly worrying. If you're an All Blacks fan, it's worrying. If you're a South African fan, it's worrying. If you're a rugby fan, we just want to see the All Blacks back to being really competitive, I think. And I think that's probably what the likes of Ardie Savea want as well. He knows the standards. He understands what kind of level they need to be playing, and he understands they're not at that level. So the big question is, what do you think is going to happen? Let me know down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Steve. I'll chat to you soon.